My friend and yours, ladies and gentlemen, Ty Hagler.
All right, very good. Well, I appreciate the invitation to come back. And one thing about anything with, you got to make sure that the headline for this holds up to Joe's standards. I threw out a couple of different examples and how to waste 500 million with BioDesign. It seemed like it resonated, so now I've got to tie that back to what I'm actually talking about. So we're going to go on an adventure to make
You
sure that
understand the game
worth the
now.
headline. But yeah, we can understand the mission here. But I mean, so 4 topics for today. One is the way to waste $500 million is an idea-first approach to innovation, which our mutual friend in our starting place, follows that progression. But I think an empathy-first approach to innovation is the answer to the question, and I'll unpack what that means. And Sue, I think the progression you've gone through maps to this, and you identified a problem in your space and then have sought to address it. I think that's consistent. And then since, like Michelle, we've been bringing up babies. I mean, the couplet care story is about how do you take care of infants and babies immediate postpartum in the hospital and some of the real pain points that exist, because the bassinets that are there are designed for really an old style of care, and that the standard of care has updated, but the bassinets have not caught up yet until today. And we'll talk about that. And then if anybody's a fan of Dan Ariely, I love the joke that he has of the Center for Advanced Hindsight. So if we have time, I want to get into some advanced hindsight and product development, which is maybe some lessons learned about, like, if you had to learn this lesson over again, what do you wish you knew before you started in product development? And I've been collecting answers to this, which is one of my favorite things, because what's rational at the outset isn't necessarily what the best path forward is. And so let's see if we can touch on a few of those, if I can speed run through some of this. But this is about you. So if you have questions, if you want to jump in and let's touch on any of these, that's fine. I don't have to get through all my slides. There's no bonus points for hitting all the slides. So, okay, so the false dichotomy, or the real dichotomy here, is, you've got 2 different possible pathways. So the idea first approach, which is, I think 95% of medtech, is you start with some kind of proprietary technology. You've got a blockchain, you've got an AI, you've got a robotic surgical instrument, and you've got an imaging solution. And so you then go out and you start trying to find stakeholder problems to match to your technology. And so this is classically known as bench to bedside. And then from a empathy first approach, this is where you start with a proprietary understanding of the stakeholder. And these are stakeholder problems seeking technology solutions. We know what the problem is, and now we're trying to pattern match, and we've got an array of technologies that we can then fit to make sure we're perfectly solving this, and we have a North Star for this. So I describe this as bedside to bench, then back to bedside. So this is our dichotomy here. And so this is our story of idea first innovation at its worst, which is, there was a company that went out and said, let's go out and healthcare is really expensive. Let's go reduce costs. So we're going to do a study and look at what aspect of the operating room has the highest cost. And so you look at the operating room, and you know what? The anesthesiologist pushing the propofol is the highest cost aspect of the OR. Okay, cool. We've got our problem statement. Nobody asked us. We didn't ask the anesthesiologists. We just decided that this was the pain point. And so then, can we get a patent? Yes, we can get a patent. Okay, we've got a patent now, so maybe now we can move forward. Okay, can we get FDA approval on this and go through the waterfall diagram? And eventually, yes, they were able to get approval for this device. And then the question is, will hospitals purchase a device to eliminate the need for an anesthesiologist? And then it went out into the market, and then you hear corporate speak that then came in line with our strategy to further prioritize investments in high growth and strategic portfolio opportunities, our franchise made the decision to exit this business, meaning they lost $500 million trying to replace anesthesiologists. And at the end of the day, really weren't able to demonstrate any value. And so this is just a really telling story about, at what point in time do you find out that the need statement that you wrote or convinced yourself was the user need? When do you find out that that is invalid? In the case of Ethicon, they found out at the point in time when they started trying to sell it to the marketplace. And I think that is so interesting. And it speaks to, basically the fundamental problem with design controls, is that everything is predicated on did you do a good job with your user needs? And too often user needs are kind of seen as a checklist. They're poorly written. There's not enough attention placed on this. And you can fool yourself into walking your way through this and making forward progress of developing an imaging device that makes it easier to tell whether or not blood flow is happening during an open heart surgery. And like, we'll build a robot that'll come over and scan it and everything. And so like, we build up all of this cost into the system when the surgeon who's performing the procedure just puts their finger on the vessel and say, okay, yeah, it's working. Like there's like, are you actually solving for a real need? And so some of the way you do that, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, just first, I've forgotten how gifted a presenter you are. Thank you. And two, I knew from the start as a marketer, of course, you start with user needs, but perhaps I missed.
Yeah.
Of course, the anesthesiologist would resist being replaced by a robot. What was the reason that, I mean, they didn't approach it the right way, but ultimately they found what is supposedly a cost-efficient way to deliver anesthesia or local anesthesia. What was the reason it didn't get adopted?
At the end of the day, what the FDA approved as far as doing an automated system for pushing propofol was that what had been approved wasn't actually justifying the cost of adding the system in. It was too narrowly constrained. And then because of just patient safety problems with it.
So there were too few occasions in which it could be used?
Correct. And then also that the anesthesiologists were still having to sit there and you were adding complexity to the anesthesiologist's job. So at the end of the day, they cleared all of these steps, but there wasn't actually real value being delivered.
Right. Well, between those two, the anesthesiologist stays in the room. That was the whole effing point. So
yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think some of these we're going to replace the healthcare provider from practicing at the top of their license. I think those are fool's errands in terms of where to really solve real problems in healthcare. So like, I think this unfortunately was one of those. And I think I think there's definitely a bubble in robotic surgical instruments that are out there. At the end of the day, it's still a very highly skilled surgeon who is operating it. And you're basically putting a robotic middleman in between the surgeon and the patient. And to what degree are you actually delivering better outcomes for the patient versus just adding more cost to the system? I think there's some real like deep questions to be asked there with a lot of the justification for robotic platforms that exist. And I think the Sedasis system was an early example of this, but I've worked on too many robotic programs that like, at the end of the day, it employed a lot of designers and engineers, but I'm not sure it really makes sense. So
we had a question specifically about your expertise. I shared your LinkedIn profile. I learned years ago that there's a difference in engineers. There's the mechanical one, and there's the electrical one, and there's other ones, the software one, all of the. What specifically is your gift?
My training is as an industrial designer. So I went to school at Georgia Tech, started in mechanical engineering, and so my profession is about working on the human experience, kind of what is the external factor of this, and then also have an MBA. I've been running a business and all of that. So, yeah.
Bruce writes it's an invention ahead of its time. I don't think I see that, given what we've learned, that it's too niche and it doesn't solve the problem of removing the highest cost. Bruce, do you want to comment?
Well, yeah, that's possible today, but things change over time as we become more adept, and let's look at what AI has been doing here in just the last couple of years. So today, yes, it's been identified that there still needs to be an anesthesiologist in the room, but maybe in the future that won't be as critical. Maybe the technology would develop beyond what it is, and especially with the advent and development of AI, it could make a big difference in how that's perceived even 5 years from now.
I wouldn't invest in it, but then again.
Yeah, exactly. I also look at the fact that the U.S. healthcare system is the fastest inflating in terms of cost sector of the U.S. economy. And we also have some of the worst outcomes. And so it may be, something that we eventually get there, but I just wonder if we're spending our talent and resources in the right spaces by trying to automate some of this when there's other driving costs that we could look at that can deliver, better health outcomes. So it could be ahead of its time, but I do feel like, as an idea first approach, there's better ways to do this. And I'm just, I think that's kind of the challenge here, because at the end of the day, it's being able to go through and validate needs. And so you look at the Stanford BioDesign process. I don't have a problem really with Stanford BioDesign. I think it works really, really well in Stanford. And I think then when it starts to, it's kind of the Toyota production system. It works really well within the Toyota environment. And then when it starts to get outside of that environment, then things shift and people aren't like, or they look at this as a linear progression, as opposed to something where do not pass go, do not collect $200 if your need screening doesn't actually work. And from an academic exercise, you need to complete the you need to complete the entire process flow in order to get the certificate, complete the class. But in real life, you should not move forward from step 2 in this. And I think that's something that is just a thought for us to reflect upon. The other way you could do this is have a clinical co-founder of just somebody to call you out on your bullshit. Of like, I do not want a robot looking over my shoulder when I'm performing a surgery, right? Like having that level of feedback in place so that you can truly identify what are the big unmet needs in the space. So you're actually adding value as opposed to adding cost. Yeah, Sean, you've got your hand raised.
Hi, Sean Smith. I don't think we met.
No, we haven't had the pleasure.
Good to meet you. So years ago, when I worked at Thompson Publishing Group as a marketing manager, we used to do this thing with product development where we produced these binders and we'd have an expert author and monthly newsletters, and they cost about $500 to $700 a year. And a lot of people in the industry subscribed to them. What we would do is what was called a wet test. And we would go out and purchase about 150,000 names from list brokers and do a direct mail piece. And if we didn't get a 0.30 response rate on the direct mail campaign, we killed the product. But we would produce the direct mail piece as though the product existed and it were ready to ship. And if we got the orders, then we produced the product. And if we didn't get the orders, we killed the product and said, well, we thought it was a good idea. We thought people were going to be interested in Medufa or whatever. And they're not. They're not willing to put up the money. And it was a really, really effective way to spend $60,000 to determine whether or not there was a future for this thing. And it was built into the budget. And it worked fabulously. What I've discovered is that a lot of clients come to me, particularly with software, and they say, oh, we just need you to help us get leads. We just need you to help us market this thing. And I'm like, no, there's no demand for this product that you have, and so I, just wanted to sort of echo what you were saying and, just learn, figure it out early. Don't figure it out after you've built the product that nobody wants it, because it's a disaster.
Yeah, and I think you can hide within the process and how complex medical device development is. You can hide for a long time before you actually find out, Sean, what you're learning, which is like, does it work or not from a will anybody purchase it? I love that example you shared.
Nellie?
So it's interesting that you bring up that you should have a co-founder that's kind of like the challenge type person. I can tell you, as the quality person sitting and listening to the teams and the different, because I have like 9 clients, so I hear them all. And they're all seeking the person who's going to think of their product favorably, who's going to like it, who are we going to be able to count on. I think that's a very valuable thing that you just said, because I can tell you where there's many clients that they get to V&V and they have to go back to design because it's not, the user testing isn't going well and people aren't liking it. And I think that's probably the most valuable thing for me that you say, if we could communicate widely out there, is have the person that you least think is going to like the product, because if you win them over, you can win anybody over.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Seek disconfirming evidence, right? The idea won't work and try to kill it as early as you possibly can.
Yeah.
But I think another way to make sure you can accept what they say, though, is to ask that challenger personality, what would have to be true for you to support this?
Yes. Because you still get people's opinions versus how do I win you over from a technical concept?
Right. And one of my favorite books on that topic you raised is called The Mom Test. I have it like sitting next to me here. But it's a very pragmatic way of merging the market research side of the world with the entrepreneurial side of the world. And usually those two worlds don't talk to each other. Market research is its own, like, kind of ivory tower, or like, kind of research institution. And the entrepreneurs are kind of over here, just make it work, sell the thing. And so having a really good balance between those two, it's such a great book. And it's under the premise that if you ask your mother whether or not she will buy your product, then she will lie to you and say, oh, honey, no, it's okay. It's fine. I'll buy it from you, and not actually buy it later. So you need to be able to reasonably get that disconfirming evidence.
I stopped the sharing only because we
Yeah.
have
I
so
was
many
wondering what
questions.
happened. Yeah.
Eddie?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff that you're saying resonates very strongly with me. But I mean, again, I'm sure, it's that whole thing of the multi-factor elements in medical device world. Yes, you want to help the patient, but you've got the clinician as you're pointing in the anesthesiologist example. But you can look at that in ultrasound. You can look at that in, I did a skin imaging thing. Loads of places, it's about the behavioral change at the clinician, and then you got the payer, and so you got the whole health economics thing. So it's a really, really complex set of things, which I think is people really do have to keep in mind. But yeah, we're very much of the mind of saying, why wouldn't this work? I always want the bad news of why it wouldn't, because then you build the answer for the next time you're speaking to somebody as to why they should be interested.
Yeah, 100%. Because you've got 4 different stakeholders, and one of the examples within couplet care is there were features that if we went one way, we made the nurses happy, but if we went the other way, we would make the mothers happy. And it is a binary choice with one feature as far as like how you design that feature. And you have to make a choice. And how are you balancing those competing feature trade-offs?
Yeah.
Susie can't be heard.
I clicked the wrong button. And you're probably getting to this, but the easiest way to figure out if it's something customers want is to conduct customer discovery and clinical trials, right? And that way you know definitively if your product is something that they want or something that they don't want.
Well, actually, Sue, on that point, we did patient, discovery, and we asked them, these are users of, so we do catheters, the users of catheters. And like the biggest idea they could come up with to us was, could you make the bag so people couldn't see that it's my pee in the bag? And that would be like hugely meaningful to my life. And so when we explained to them, well, actually, we don't have a bag. And also you'd have to go through and explain why the bag has to be clear so you can see the quality of the urine and so on and so forth. There's loads of reasons, but it's so interesting how so many people only anchor on what's in front of them and only think about the margins of change. And I have also been involved in things where the change is so radical that again, I go back to watch the first 20 minutes of The Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith, and you'll know.
Paul?
Joe, you haven't spoken about what was that list you were talking to a couple of years ago? 52 ways to lose, to fail or to market. Like all the. So you want to launch a startup, right? And you had something about all the must-dos to create a startup. What you're talking about, and that's what I was reminded of, because what you're talking about is fundamental, right? If you're trying to and I agree, because I'm trying to figure out what are we really talking about here. I've spent a lot of time in marketing and sales, ideation, mentoring startups, supply chain, right? That's an area. And yes, I think like Sue was talking about, are not people, or you're not seeing people do research, market research, and you talk about medical devices, they, from design. Like I'm always at the design level for medical devices and other products which we do in the supply chain space, saying consider supply chain in the design stage so you can do modular and think about the supply chain you want to have, as an example. talking to Nick, right, at the last event that we had in LA, in Orange County, and he was talking about reimbursement, right, from our community here. And my gosh, how many medical device companies are locating the ICD-9s up front and figure what is their, the reimbursement strategy? How will they get paid? Who's going to pay them? And what are the inflection points? So yes, you're talking about a lot of stuff, but I think in the medical device space, it's even more compounded, right?
Right.
Just because there's an idea and you can do this doesn't make economic sense. I mean, Bruce here on the call is a closet inventor, and from non-medical, non-pharma type products to pharma type products that are really worthy of we're trying to go into open doors into large pharma. I don't know, Bruce, you've got an opinion on how you've done some cool stuff and brought your products ahead. But to Ty's point, I'm not sure what I'm listening for, but what I'm not hearing is a structured approach to go about it. I don't know if you're getting to that in your, because what are all in the medical device space, what are all the areas that you got to do the research to make sure it's even viable? Which is first, which is second? I mean, that's what I'm just listening for. So.
Oh yeah, we're probably at the first 5 or 6 slides of a longer presentation. I can jump into some of that if you'd like.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And Paul, I'm going to try to get to your question there. And maybe a concept here is, I think I'll run into the goose innovator. You're aware of the goose, right? It's an animal that it can swim, it can fly, and it can walk, but it doesn't do any of those very well, right? Like it's very adaptive. And I think the challenge of soul, I guess, people who go through this, try to acquire all of the skills that it takes in order to do a medical device. And they're asking the how question, become these geese who are one-stop shop, do it all, versus asking the who question. And I think, Joe, this is what your group is about, is let's ask the who question of who can help me solve this problem from a supply chain standpoint, from a design standpoint, from a clinical expertise standpoint, engineering, ask the who question to get there as opposed to asking the how question. I think
that's interesting. If I had thought of having a goose be our mascot.
Or no geese, right? Something like that, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, just as a marketing concept for you there, Joe. But I think the interesting thing, and this is kind of, Paul, to answer your question, of the problem is that and I mentor a lot of biomedical engineering students, and they go out into the hospital, this program sends them off to go discover needs, and then they go start working with the clinician, and the clinician is trying to describe the complexity of what they're dealing with. And when they're interacting with an engineer, they're like, how do I boil this down into something that gives this person clear direction? And there's kind of this moment where they realize this is harder to describe than I realized. And the engineer then responds to this, well, this is confusing. I'm going to filter for what problems match my capabilities. And this dynamic happens over and over and over again. That's part of the reason why you see so many idea-first, tech-led, tech-first projects that are out there. And so I think there's been, and I think Johnson & Johnson has, I don't know if this is a direct result, but I've seen the work they've done with the Nurse Innovation Fellowship Program, and I've been very fortunate to call Dr. Marianne Leary a friend, and she joined us on the podcast, and I'd encourage you to check out that podcast episode. But what they've been doing with training clinicians in innovation, I think has been a key, nurse-led innovation has been one of the trending topics, I think, in the healthcare space. So it's definitely something to check out and see. And some of the people that have gone through this fellowship have been kind of key leaders in that space. Okay, so Paul, I'm getting now to the slide that I was trying to get to. From a process flow standpoint, we want to do is start with not the idea, but the problem scope. And let's clearly define what is the problem we're trying to address. And then from a training standpoint, we then go through an empathy module where we go through and try to prioritize what is a clearly described unmet need, and make sure we don't go forward until we've validated that need. So we're addressing, Sean's point earlier of don't go forward until you've make sure this is a problem that people are that want to consider. And then you go through and generate ideas. And so we bank ideas as we go because we're always coming up with them. But then a second screen is then looking at this and going okay, well, if this works, now let's go forward and go out and apply for grants, go out, try to get some preliminary funding to then pursue this. And then we start building up the business case, make sure that the health economics and market access analysis has been done so that we don't get too far down the road and have skipped over reimbursement. And then after we've gotten through all of these steps and a logical progression of reducing risk, then you can start going into the fast commercialization steps of having your right manufacturing in place, making sure you've got your supply chain in place, make sure you've got all of your ducks in a row so that when it's time to launch, you've done all of the slow planning up front. So that's just the model we try to teach. Okay, so a lot of that has then been built up as a result of the couplet care story and lessons learned there, which is the kind of cool part of the story I want to share. Okay, so here this was originated as a clearly defined problem through the PhD research of Dr. Kristen Tully. She's a medical anthropologist who came out of Notre Dame. And as part of her research, she, and this is published research she had done in 2012, was looking at the design of the infant bassinets was built around nurseries as a standalone care that basically pediatricians would round on the infants. It was very convenient for pediatricians to go through and just, kind of assembly line, go see all the infants in their care. And it was easier from a pediatrician standpoint. And then also the formula industry, who was trying to promote formula instead of breast milk, also would fund the creation of these nurseries as separate facilities. So then when the health benefits of breastfeeding became, much more scientifically based, then there's been this shift of having infants room in with mother in order to promote skin-to-skin contact, more healthy breastfeeding. So this was a discussion between Dr. Tully and Dr. Seashore, who's the senior pediatrician over at UNC Health. We're seeing this need and change in the standard of care, and yet the infrastructure was designed for a different standard of care. So how do we address this? And so you can see just this moment of a new mother who just can't access her infant. So she's just kind of, her arm is falling asleep. It's just kind of dangling over the bassinet because she can't reach her infant. And if she's recovering from a C-section or she's on magnesium, then it's that much more painful, especially if her infant wakes up and is crying and her partner is asleep and, just can't access. There's a major barrier that exists today with the current bassinets, but you wouldn't see it if not for being a patient advocate for mothers. And so what's interesting here from a model standpoint, also, Paul, to answer your question of from an empathy first standpoint, where should you start? And I do believe that one of the North Star and guiding elements of the couplet care story has been passion, is that we believe in the importance of solving the problem. And then building up full empathy for each of the stakeholders who are surrounded by the problem. And then building up the creativity to be able to generate lots of new ideas, expertise from a supply chain, manufacturing, engineering standpoint to actually pull it off, and credibility of being able to go out and attract the financial resources and able to fund the entire business model. So early days, it was pretty big on passion and empathy, but really didn't have the right partners in place. So I was fortunate to get partnered with Dr. Tully. So she and I were co-principal investigators on a phase 1 SBIR grant. And we were awarded the grant and then went through and developed a series of prototypes to then start answering this question of how might the bassinet come to the parent instead of the parent having to come to the bassinet. And you see some early prototypes as we iterated on this. We did some work with some design students at NC State to kind of generate lots of different potential concepts. And then as we went through that, we then really found that, okay, we've got prototypes, we're getting validation. And so now as part of the phase 1 study, we then by the time we got to the Gen 3 device, this was actually put in use in a limited study with mothers and infants at UNC Health. And so we're able to demonstrate that, yes, this actually does deliver on the promise of, and this is some of the kind of current pitch deck slides, that it was shown to reduce nurse time by 73% for non-medical activities. That the nurses who are working in postpartum care are having to do a lot of running back and forth in order to help moms access their infants, just because the infrastructure isn't set up. So we saw a significant reduction in nurse time in the room. And then also from a out of room time where mom just needs a break because she can't access the infant. So a 60% reduction compared to other bassinets, which is just seeing big impact around this. And so that's where, as we've gone through these different prototypes to get to a solution that, we're expecting to clear all of our regulatory steps in the next few weeks so that we can then say that it's available for sale. And then with our supply chain fully mapped out at this point, then we're expecting to be able to ship products by Q1 next year. So we're rapidly approaching full commercialization here, which is a really exciting time to be talking about this, because it's been a 7-year journey to get to this point through a lot of bumps and bruises along the way. And so it's just really fun to finally be able to talk about this. So in terms of the team, Dr. Tully is one of the fiercest advocates for patients and postpartum mothers. But it really was pulling on Stacey McIntyre, where she had been the CEO and founder of a series of hospital systems all up and down the I-85 corridor between North Carolina and Georgia. And then as she exited that, she's like, okay, well, I've built a bunch of hospitals. How hard can medical devices be? Rick is laughing there because he knows that's just a very different world, building hospitals versus medical devices. And so anyway, she's also somebody who will just run through brick walls because she's just so mission oriented. And so she's been just a real reason why this has been able to clear a lot of these big hurdles that we've encountered. And so we've got some great advisors and investors in the company as well. So today it's a very robust team that's then going through and doing, doing the tour of the National A1 convention and whatnot. So it's been really cool to get a chance to see the impact this is starting to have on mothers and infants as it is maturing and moving towards full commercialization. Okay, I'm going to stop there and just pause for a second. And if I can get to advanced hindsight, that's cool. But I also see we're up on time and want to make sure I'm just kind of catching up on what I just shared there. So. And Nelly, I saw you come off mute too, so I wasn't sure if you wanted to jump in.
No, I just think very fascinating discussion. Being the quality person, a lot of the things you're talking about, it's kind of like, and you see your clients not thinking about it and considering it and almost taking it for granted. And then it's like later in the game, they're like, oh, darn, we should have done this. Now we have to go back. It's just, I've seen it time and time again. And I just wish there could be like a huge banner that says, hey, here are the 5 key things you need to think about, quality, regulatory, your strategies and everything. There's just so much to consider.
Yeah, it's a complex environment, right? And how do you pick what your North Star is, right?
Well, that Ty, yeah, I mean, again, one of the other interesting things from my perspective and the experience with Ingenian is that it's really encouraging when we're talking to people and hearing some of the issues that they have that we didn't realize our design was solving. Actually, one of the big ones that we talk about more and more actually came from the last 10X in London, when Joe found that that woman from Boston Scientific about the
net zero.
The net zero thing. Yeah, I was sure I was going to be bored by that. And by the end of her talk, I was like, wow, this is now going to be one of our leading things to sell into the NHS, because our device replaces maybe 300 intermittent catheters every month. So, we hadn't been thinking about it in that way, but that's also something which 5 years ago wasn't really a thing.
Did you find that
in fact, Joe,
just was helpful?
Just in the past week, we've started engaging with the NHS and NICE. So they're seeming to be really responsive, and that either means I found the very few efficient people in the NHS, or they seem to be really interested. So watch this space.
Nice.
That's huge. How many different other devices are you replacing?
So the way urinary retention is dealt with, you can either have a very cheap old world Foley catheter, but then you have a bag and tubes coming out of your body and loads of infection. But urinary retention is also treated today with intermittent catheterizations. Basically, you have to the patient is trained to insert basically a tube every time they need to pee. Okay. Well, that can be up to 5-8 times per day. Over a month, there's going to be 150 to 250 individual devices. And even though they're very cheap, that's a lot of, and then there's all the packaging, every one of those things, because they all have to be packaged sterile, right?
Yeah.
So one of our devices is in for the patient for a month. And so we're now, like I say, when we get to the point of doing advertising, I want to put a month's worth of intermittents and wrappers and, boxes and instructions for use all on a table, used in a sense, next to one of our devices.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool.
Okay, let's continue.
All right, very good. All right, so let's talk about advanced hindsight, which any other Dan Ariely fans here of predictably irrational behavior, which in medical device development, there is some predictably irrational behavior. So from a, I don't know, kind of process model, and Paul, this might resonate for you, of like that progression of steps of going from like sticky notes and sketches and like napkin doodles and whatnot, all the way through to like, you know, like full scale production, you know, 1,000+ units in an order, and like, you know, you've got absolute certainty that this is meeting a market need, right? And then you've got kind of all of the messy middle in between, right? Of like, you know, storyboards and renderings, physical demo units, like works like, feels like models, you know, kind of first article of inspection, T1 alpha models, you know, like you've got a number of different scales of magnitude. And what's been interesting is kind of watching this progression over time with couplet care. I've really been seeing real time what the value of each of these is. And so then you start asking this question of like, you know, and I've been trying to consistently ask this of our clients that are like, have gone on the other end of this, you know, story, but, you know, what do you know now about product development that you wish you knew at the beginning of the project? And so there's been a whole array of, you know, responses to this, but there's two I thought were worth highlighting. And I'd love to hear kind of your own reflections on this, but let me touch on the two that I've picked up. One is the cost per lesson learned as a metric. So if you're doing it right, you're going to prototype far more than you expect, because quality, Nelly, quality matters over rushing something to scale that doesn't work.
Yep.
And so you think about our distribution of, if we're spending very little money at level 1, it would be really efficient to learn all of our lessons in sticky notes. If we could find a way to do that, that'd be awesome, right? To like, you know, get all of our tests done just at a sticky note level, somebody who's just a guru at illustrating on a sticky note, right? That could be like the best way to learn all of our lessons. And then we actually start committing real capital, then it's kind of a straight path all the way through. And how often does that happen, right? So what typically happens is we then say, well, no, this is a linear progression of steps, and it doesn't feel good. We're predictably irrational, and we say, you know what, let's build all the way up as close as we can to perfect. And my last talk here was the perfect prototype doesn't exist. But let's try to rush to this point in time in order to learn our lesson. And then we wind up realize we have sad feelings because we learn our lesson here and we realize we have to go back to the drawing board. And so it's almost like there's this push. And then in some cases, you know, like we might push all the way through and then start a quality management system and then start doing our user testing. And we're at like the level where we've already bought steel tooling for this. And I've got a laparoscopic instrument next to me here that was, I think they sold maybe 500 of these, and they bought steel tooling for this monster. And anyway, it's just my favorite example of like how to misallocate the, you know, kind of when you actually apply for your lesson learned. So that's one example of this, of just, you know, like your cost per lesson learned is a key principle. And the next one is interesting, which is maybe more of a venting session, is specialist shops versus one-stop shop. And this is where you have this back and forth of, should you, when you're committing to product development, should you do it with a series of separate shops, or should you commit to one bundled contract where you can do a design for manufacturer vendor? So that is a really interesting strategic question. And with couplet care, I had a chance to see both ends of this, of where, you know, like basically you've got a series of specialist shops where we go through and we've got different vendors who go through different aspects of it. You then are able to source a specialist manufacturer, a specialist assembler. You pick the right third-party logistics and distributor, and like you kind of assemble this hodgepodge of a lot of different firms in order to pull it off. Versus there's the attraction and appeal of a one-stop shop. Of it's an end-to-end, they've acquired a bunch of design firms and engineering firms, and they've been adding sheet metal to their production process line so they can do the whole thing, right? And so then it's a question of which of these makes the most sense. And so with the one-stop shop, our Gen 4 device was done with a one-stop shop. And so this makes sense if your core competency is raising money. Like if you've got Joe on your team, Joe has access to deep pockets, he can help you afford the one-stop shop. And what I've found is that they're really good at manufacturing for design, meaning they really want whatever manufacturing capabilities they have, they want your design to fit into what they can do at scale. But design for manufacturing isn't necessarily a key part of this, because their success comes from economies of scale. Now, one thing to watch out for here is the product requirements shield. If you're going to go down this path, You want to make sure your product requirements are very clearly defined and bulletproof, because if there's anything that emerges that's outside of the product requirements, then that's the gotcha for anything that gets outside of scope. And that's where your user needs might change, but if the product requirements haven't kept up with it, then that's really where that defensive mechanism kind of kicks in. Winds up being higher costs in total. You have low leverage because the minute you find out they've got a more expensive supply chain, you're still locked in because you're just kind of going over this waterfall together. The other thing I've found is that you do have the benefit of one throat to choke, but you're not the first one to try to choke them. They've got very good legal defenses in place when the inevitable shit hits the fan, which happened in this case. So won't reveal who that manufacturer was, but it was not pretty. Versus,
I encourage you at some point after the call, if you don't already, to get to know Rick Stockton better, because you used the 3 words that are strung together that make me think, oh, you should call Rick, and that's design for manufacturing.
yeah. No, that's absolutely, Rick. We should talk.
I thought the most interesting thing you said was manufacturing for design, and perfectly good in context here. And the other interesting thing is, one throat to choke, which is everybody likes one person to call, but they may not be the easiest people to talk to. So
Maybe because they've been choked.
how about
so-
the other way?
Maybe because their larynx has been crushed.
No, they've got really good lawyers. Like, it's almost like you fall into this process of a disagreement and, oh, we've done this before, send us an email. And it's like this practiced ritual that happens. It was fascinating. So I was on the outside of that, but watching it go through, it was interesting. So then let's take it the other way of a series of specialist shops. So you as the entrepreneur, your competency is not necessarily raising funds, but product management. You've got a lot of different entities to manage. You've got a lot of plate spinning. You've got to make sure that the different specialists are coordinated. If Trig is doing the design and Rick is doing the design for manufacturer, then making sure the 2 of us are talking well. I mean, that kind of falls on you to make sure that the different specialists that you've pulled in are going to do a great job for you. And so the nice thing about the specialists, though, is they live or die based upon their skill at the specialty. And, it's an anti-fragile system of, like, if one party sucks, they're not invited to the next party. So you've got a, lower total cost, you've got higher leverage over the whole process, and you can maintain tighter control over the product. So anyway, so I know we are coming up over on time, but I appreciate the invitation to share all of this with you, and the discussion's awesome. So thank you. I can hang out for a little bit longer if you guys want to chat. But I wanted
Nico
to...
has something to add.
You calling on me, Joe?
You had your hand raised.
Yes. Well, Ty, I'm normally a very agreeable person, but I do have to be a push back a little bit on the one-stop shop situation.
Yes, please go ahead.
I mean, we are, I think, something that's in between the two. That's a hybrid, because we consider ourselves, from concept to quantity. We're an FDA registered manufacturer, but we also have a full complement of engineers on staff, electrical, mechanical, software, regulatory, and so forth. And what we found is that by leveraging what we can do, bringing a product all the way through, actually is better than working with specialist shops, because what happens with specialist shops is that they start pointing fingers at each other and nobody takes the responsibility for a design. And so therefore, if we are, as I said, the hybrid, where we take on the whole project, and we may bring in some specialist shops, but then we are responsible and we make sure it goes through to the end. So, I think that, all your negatives may not be totally on the one-stop shop, of course, defending my company and what we've done for clients, and actually at better cost than they did with the specialist shops.
Cool. I wasn't sure whose foot I was going to step on with that one. And it could just be that one-stop shop in particular that just, they just did a horrible job for us, but that's been my experience. But it sounds like you've got great contrarian experiences there too, to really demonstrate value. And yeah, I think it's you've got a array of choices in front of you, and it sounds like you've got an awesome business model there. So
Before we conclude, I'm getting a few notes of people jumping off. Next week, Jose Borges joins us to discuss the agony and ecstasy of 7-figure engagements when you're a small firm. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. After that, I'm sure all of you are at least ambiently familiar with what happened with CrowdStrike and all the airlines and the like. Our friends over at MedCrypt are going to come back and talk to us about what an outage like that, what the impact could be if it hasn't happened on medical devices. And last, we welcome Donovan back. He's been absent a while. He switched positions in a new firm. Donovan, you want to just tell us quickly? We can't hear you, even though you've taken yourself off mute. Yeah, user error. Yeah.
Check 1, 2.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we hear you.
Well, I see some familiar faces, and thank you. Never stopped, just couldn't join the calls due to prior engagements and responsibilities. But I'm back. I'm with a company called Shift, and with a Y, and we are a division of TD SYNNEX. And we are, our biggest claim to fame is we are the #1 repair company for Philips. So we do repairs around the globe. We've got 5 locations: Singapore, Netherlands, Poland, Ohio, and Sacramento.
Be sure to come next week. I know Paul
Yep.
had to jump off the call.
Yep.
but
So
I think
lots
he's
of other good
the first
stuff.
natural person for you to talk with and become refamiliar with.
Wonderful.
So welcome back. And for Joe Hage and Joe Hage Enterprises, this has been Joe Hage. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
And don't be a stranger. Don't just show up when you're presenting. Come anytime.
I will try to make the next one.
You bet. Bye now.